When Philip II of Macedon fell to an assassin's dagger at the theater of Aigai in the summer of 336 BC, his 20-year-old son Alexander inherited an uneasy realm. Within weeks, the new king moved with breathtaking decisiveness. At Pella, he performed the ritual of succession, sacrificing to Zeus Ammon and claiming his divine favor. Rumors of his illegitimacy, whispers that Philip was not his father, swirled among the Macedonian nobility, but Alexander quelled them by his swift assumption of power. He executed potential conspirators, including Amyntas IV, a rival claimant, and sent envoys to secure the loyalty of the Greek city-states at Corinth. Danger lay on two fronts. In the north, the Illyrian chieftains saw an opportunity to rebel. Within days of his coronation, Alexander led a rapid winter campaign down the Aragon and Elpius valleys, routing the Illyrians at Pelion. His shock of youthful daring, riding at the head of the companion cavalry through a hail of javelins, did more to secure Macedonian borders than any treaty. Meanwhile, in the Greek south, Thebes and Athens toyed with revolt. With characteristic boldness, Alexander marched his army into southern Greece, summoned the city-states to reaffirm the League of Corinth, and when Thebes rebelled, laid the city to waste. The destruction of Thebes sent a stark message. Resistance to the new regime invited annihilation. Back in Macedon, Alexander reorganized the administrative machinery his father had built. He replaced recalcitrant satraps with men of proven loyalty. Many were veteran officers from Philip's campaigns against the Persians. He reinforced the companion cavalry and adopted the Sarissa-armed phalanx, but rewarded merit above rank, promoting young captains who had rallied to his side in the confusion after Philip's death. In dispatches to the Persian court, he styled himself King of Macedon and Hegemon of the Greeks, preserving nominal Persian suzerainty while asserting Greek leadership. By the spring of 335 BC, Macedon's frontiers were secure and Greece lay pacified. The Corinthian League met at Corinth's sanctuary of Poseidon, where Alexander presided in Philip's place. He obtained a vote renewing the League's mandate to wage war against Persia. This was an implicit recognition that Philip's project would continue under his youthful heir. With political unity enforced by both clemency and terror, Alexander turned his mind to the grander stage his father had prepared, the conquest of the Achaemenid Empire. Before crossing the Hellespont, Alexander spent the winter in Macedonia consolidating finances, mustering ships from coastal cities, and assembling siege engines. He married Roxana of Bactria to cement ties with Eastern allies and adopted Persian customs in preparation for his future role as ruler of Asia. He also consulted oracles. At Delphi he offered lavish gifts, and at Ammon in the Siwa oasis, he accepted the divine title Son of Zeus, ensuring that his soldiers would fight not merely for spoils but for their king's semi-divine destiny. Thus, in less than 2 years, Alexander transformed potential chaos into unassailable authority. He had confronted rebellion, quelled dissent with characteristic ruthlessness, and bound Greece to his plans for eastern conquest. By the spring of 334 BC, when his forces assembled at Abydos and crossed the narrow strait into Asia Minor, he led not a regicidal factional army, but the united might of Macedon and Greece. His accession and consolidation had proven that the Boyking of Pella was no mere placeholder, but a commander of singular vision, a ruler poised to rewrite the map of the ancient world. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor, a symbolic and decisive act that transformed Macedon's ambitions into reality. The strait at Abydos was narrowed by a chain of rafts anchored to both shores, over which crossed a force of some 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, consisting of companion squadrons and allied Greek hoplites. The crossing was more than a logistical feat. It proclaimed Alexander's determination to carry Persia's war into its very heartland. As the troops disembarked on Anatolian soil, they camped beneath the walls of Troy, where Alexander sacrificed at the tomb of Achilles and recited Homeric verses, invoking the spirit of the Iliad to steel his men for the battles ahead. His first major engagement came at the Granicus River, where a satrapal army composed of Persian cavalry and Greek mercenaries challenged Alexander's advance. The riverbanks were steep, and the Macedonian phalanx waded across under a storm of arrows. At the river's edge, Alexander personally led the companion cavalry in a ferocious charge that broke the Persian left. The phalanx followed, rolling up the enemy center. The The Granicus victory, though costly, shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility and opened Anatolia for the invaders. City after city, from Sardis to Ephesus, submitted willingly or by force, as Alexander portrayed himself as both liberator of Greek cities and successor to Darius's imperium. In the summer of 333 BC, Alexander reached Issus, where Darius III had assembled a much larger army. The narrow coastal plain there neutralized Persian numerical advantage. Alexander arranged his phalanx and Hydaspes in wedge formations at the center, while the companion cavalry massed on the right flank. The decisive moment came when Alexander personally led the cavalry charge around the Persian left, routing Darius's guards and forcing his flight. The Persian king abandoned his camp, leaving behind his family and immense treasure. This stunning victory earned Alexander control of southern Anatolia and Syria, as well as the credibility to claim the Persian title of king. The conquest of the Levant followed swift on Issus's heels. Tyre and Gaza, strategically vital ports, resisted stubbornly. At Tyre, Alexander besieged the island city for 7 months, constructing a causeway that eventually enabled his forces to breach its walls. The siege employed giant siege engines and demonstrated his mastery of both engineering and psychological warfare. Gaza fell similarly, opening the route to Egypt. With these coastal bastions secured, Alexander could sustain his supply lines and project naval power. Throughout these campaigns, Alexander displayed a rare combination of boldness and cunning. He parleyed with local elites, installed friendly governors, and respected native cults, thereby winning the goodwill of many subjugated peoples. He also absorbed Greek cities into the Corinthian League, compelling them to contribute ships and men to his navy. Meanwhile, he drew deeply on the Macedonian phalanx's discipline and the companions' shock tactics, forging a military machine that blended combined arms flexibility with unyielding aggression. By the autumn of 332 BC, Alexander stood at the threshold of Egypt. His campaign had shattered Persian control in Asia Minor, Syria, and Phoenicia. More than a series of victories, these years had demonstrated his capacity to integrate new territories, to innovate in siegecraft and logistics, and to inspire loyalty among his diverse army. The crossing of the Hellespont had been the first act in a drama of unprecedented scale, one that would soon turn toward the fabled Nile and a coronation at the Oracle of Amun. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt in late 332 BC, he did so as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The Persian satrapies there had collapsed under provincial revolts, and local Egyptian priests welcomed the Macedonian as their new master. Alexander's march down the Nile Valley was marked by ritual deference to pharaohic traditions. In Memphis, the ancient capital, priests hastily prepared temples for his arrival, and Alexander offered sacrifices to Ptah, the creator god, thereby legitimizing his rule in the eyes of Egyptian religious authorities. Yet Alexander's most significant act in Egypt came at the oasis of Siwa, where the renowned Oracle of Amun lay hidden among desert sands. Determined to confirm his semi-divine status, Alexander embarked on a dangerous camel journey across the western desert. His arrival at the Siwa temple was met with austere ceremony. According to later accounts, the oracle hailed him as the son of Amun, Zeus's Egyptian counterpart, thus bolstering his claim to cosmic favor. This divine endorsement had profound political implications. It fused Macedonian monarchy, Greek hero cult, and Egyptian pharaohic ideology into a single persona. From that moment, Alexander styled himself not merely as military hegemon, but as living god-king, a union of the Greek and Egyptian divine orders. Concurrent with his oracular visit, Alexander founded a new city on the Nile's western delta, at a site chosen for its strategic harbor and proximity to grain-growing regions. Alexandria was laid out according to a grid plan, with broad avenues converging on a royal quarter and a great harbor to accommodate warships and merchant vessels alike. He invited Greek settlers, architects, and scholars to colonize it, while guaranteeing religious freedom to native Egyptians. The city swiftly grew into a cosmopolitan hub, its library and museum destined to become centers of learning, its lighthouse on Pharos Island a marvel visible for miles at sea. In Alexandria and Memphis, Alexander adopted full pharaonic regalia. He sat upon the throne of Ramses II, wearing the double crown, and received homage as pharaoh. Yet in sealing treaties and issuing decrees, he also wrote in Greek, demonstrating his intention to rule a multi-ethnic empire through dual traditions. His appointment of Cleomenes, a Spartan, as governor of Egypt ensured military security, while his respect for Egyptian land tenure and temple economies reassured local elites that their privileges would endure. Politically, Egypt offered Alexander a vital base. With its vast grain resources and relative stability, the region could provision his army's onward push toward Persia. He outfitted new cohorts from Egyptian levies and recruited sailors for his nascent navy. Moreover, by acknowledging Amun's oracle, he created a potent mythos that would sustain his cult long after his death. By the spring of 331 BC, Alexander had consolidated his hold on Egypt. He returned north to Syria, leaving behind a legacy that fused Greek urbanism with Egyptian religious symbolism. Alexandria would become the empire's cultural capital, a testament to Alexander's vision of unifying East and West. By proclaiming himself pharaoh of Egypt and son of Amun, Alexander embraced both political authority and divine kingship. From his coronation at Memphis to his solemn visit to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis, he wove Egyptian religious traditions into his own Hellenic identity. No longer merely the Macedonian heir from Pella, he now stood as the living embodiment of Egyptian royal ideology, divinely sanctioned to rule and destined to reshape the ancient world under the auspices of both Greek and Egyptian gods. After leaving Egypt's golden fields to his regent Cleomenes, Alexander returned to Syria in mid-331 BC, poised to finish the campaign that had begun at the Granicus just 3 years earlier. His immediate objective was the Persian heartland itself, but to reach it he first had to secure Asia Minor and the Levantine corridor. Marching north from Gaza, his army retraced campaigns through Phoenicia, but this time met minimal resistance. By accepting the terms of his earlier kindness, to spare temples and citizen lives, Alexander's reputation facilitated the peaceful submission of many coastal cities. Yet strategic strongpoints still required direct action, and his engineering corps repaired roads, raised pontoon bridges across swollen rivers, and reinforced garrisons at Tyre and Gaza, ensuring secure lines of communication and supply. Crossing into Cilicia and then Cappadocia, Alexander navigated mountain passes that Persian satraps had once used to move their armies. His tactics combined speed with deception. Small detachments feinted toward fortified passes while the main column forced lesser-guarded defile. This approach sowed confusion among the enemy and minimized costly frontal assaults. The decisive engagement at Gaugamela in October 331 BC marked the culmination of this maneuver warfare. Choosing a broad plain near Arbela rather than the narrow ground favored by local defenses, Darius arrayed his forces in traditional Persian fashion. Chariots and cavalry on the flanks, infantry at the center. Alexander, commanding the right wing, led the companion cavalry in a bold wedge formation that punched through Darius's left, while the phalanx advanced at an oblique angle to hold Persian infantry fast. The ensuing panic among Persian horsemen opened the center for Alexander's infantry, and Darius's flight signaled a complete collapse of organized resistance. Gaugamela secured Mesopotamia and ensured that no coalition of satraps could oppose him further. In the wake of Gaugamela, Alexander advanced on Babylon, capturing its gates through a combination of guile and siegecraft. He was welcomed by the populace, who had suffered under Persian tax farming and now hoped for lighter burdens. He honored this goodwill by restoring canal locks and reopening temples. From Babylon, he sent detachments along the Tigris to secure Susa and Persepolis, while personally leading the siege of the great ceremonial capital. Though spring floods delayed major works, Alexander's engineers under Craterus constructed siege ramps and battering rams, and after weeks of relentless assault, the city fell. Alexander's choice to burn Persepolis, whether as retribution for Xerxes' earlier destruction of Athens or as ceremonial closure, was calculated to send a potent message across the empire and cement his status as the new avenger of Hellenism. Securing Mesopotamia also meant subduing the last resistances in Media and Elam. Alexander pushed through the Zagros foothills, pursuing Darius's satraps to Ecbatana. There, he replaced Persian governors with Macedonian satraps, yet allowed local bureaucrats to remain in post, maintaining tax revenues and day-to-day administration. He instituted a policy of shared authority. Macedonian overseers and Persian functionaries worked side by side, ensuring the flow of tribute to his treasury and the feeding of his army. At the same time, he melted captured Persian gold to fund new mercenary cohorts and to reward his officers, bolstering their loyalty and enabling longer campaigning seasons. By the spring of 330 BC, Alexander had traversed the breadth of Asia Minor, toppled the Persian monarchy at Gaugamela, and sacked its capitals. What remained was a small pocket of resistance led by Bessus in Bactria. But for the moment, Alexander paused in Ecbatana to reorganize his forces. The months spent consolidating Mesopotamia highlighted his combination of psychological acumen, diplomatic flexibility, and unrelenting tactical boldness. The path to India lay open, but in moving from Asia Minor to Mesopotamia, Alexander had already reshaped the ancient Near East, uniting its economies, cultures, and armies under his rapidly spreading legend. The burning of Persepolis in late 330 BC signaled the end of the Achaemenid ceremonial empire, but Alexander knew that pockets of loyalty and rebellion still festered in the vast Persian territories. Bessus, the self-declared Artaxerxes V, had retreated east into Bactria and Sogdiana, rallying local nobles. Alexander pursued him relentlessly, intent on demonstrating that no claimant to the throne of Darius could escape Macedonian justice. The pursuit through the Iranian plateau tested his army's endurance. Dusty marches across scorched earth gave way to frigid nights in the Kopet Dag foothills. Yet Alexander's logistical genius, characterized by the stockpiling of grain in strategic depots, employing camel trains across desert plains, and forging alliances with local chieftains, kept his army supplied where Persian defenses had failed. In late 330, at the pass of Zadrukarta, Alexander captured Bessus in a daring night ambush orchestrated by Ptolemy's reconnaissance. Unmasked and tried in Ecbatana for regicide, Bessus was handed over to the local satrapies and executed, sending a chilling warning to any who dared claim the Persian mantle. Meanwhile, Alexander extended his authority by reinstating local cults and satraps who pledged fealty, blending Macedonian oversight with established traditions. This policy of selective restoration won over many governors, who preferred Macedonian leniency to chaotic rebellion. As spring 329 arrived, Alexander embarked on the conquest of Bactria, a land of fortified citadels perched on rocky spurs. The sieges at Maracanda, that is, Samarkand, and the once impenetrable Sogdian rock tested his adaptability. Faced with vertical cliffs, he ordered his men to scale one face by night, using rope ladders and scaling hooks, a tactic learned from local hill tribe experts, and opened the gates from within. The fall of these strongholds highlighted Alexander's willingness to incorporate local methods and specialists, and his soldiers' loyalty, hardened by years of campaigning, remained unshaken. In each city he passed, Alexander founded a polis bearing his name. At Maracanda and later at Alexandria Escade on the Jaxartes, he planted garrisons of veterans and Macedonian colonists, securing riverine trade routes and serving as bulwarks against future nomadic incursions. In each case, he improved water channels, rebuilt temples, and invited Greek artists and philosophers to settle, creating pockets of Hellenic culture in the heart of Central Asia. Yet it was in the Hindu Kush that Alexander confronted the true perils of this eastern march. Crossing the Pamir passes in 327 BC, he led his exhausted army into the Indus Basin. The march tested supply lines across ice-clad heights, and skirmishes with mountain tribes familiar with the terrain took a toll in men and morale. At one point, the army was trapped on narrow ledges by winter snows. Alexander personally risked his life leading a detachment to carve a path, bolstering his men's resolve and reminding them of his legendary daring. Once in the Punjab, Alexander faced the combined armies of the local king, Porus, at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC. There, he demonstrated his tactical maturity by feinting downstream before crossing under cover of night, then attacking Porus's elephantry from an unexpected flank. The ensuing clash was brutal. Macedonian phalanxes buckled under elephant charges, and Alexander himself was wounded. Yet in exploiting gaps between elephant formations and using archers to target mahouts, he broke Porus's lines. Rather than slay the defeated king, Alexander reinstated him as a client ruler, recognizing Porus's valiant defense and securing the region's loyalty. By 327 BC, Alexander's eastern advance had brought him to the limits of practical conquest. His founding of cities, integration of local elites, and use of both force and diplomacy had extended his hegemony from the Adriatic to the Hindu Kush. Yet the strain on his army and yearning to push further east would soon collide with the soldiers longing for home. Nonetheless, the campaigns through Persia into the Hindu Kush consolidated Alexander's legacy as a visionary strategist and founder of a fusion empire, even as they foreshadowed the boundaries of his imperial dream. Alexander's journey east of the Hindu Kush pushed the boundaries of the known world for his Macedonian and Gohala tribesmen. By the summer of 327 BC, his forces had descended into the fertile plains of the Punjab, confronting monsoon rains, dense jungles, and the formidable armies of the local chieftains. His first major encounter came at the Hydaspes River, modern Jhelum, where King Porus of the Paurava kingdom awaited him with an army arrayed behind oxbone stockades, war elephants, and a cavalry reinforced by local horsemen. Alexander faced not simply a battlefield, but a test of logistical ingenuity. The Hydaspes was swollen with monsoon torrents, making any river crossing an act of daring. To conceal his intentions, he feigned movements downstream, while under cover of darkness his engineers erected makeshift causeways and rafts. In the gray dawn, a detachment of lighter infantry and archers crossed at an upstream ford, securing a foothold on the opposite bank. When light infantry scrambled across first, they engaged Porus's outposts, drawing his attention while Alexander led the companion cavalry in a wide flanking sweep. The elephants thundered forward to repel the cavalry, but the ground was too marshy for their ponderous bulk. Several beasts became mired, their crews thrown into disarray. From that point, the battle turned into bloody melee. Phalanx infantry advanced under a hail of javelins. Their sarissas kept enemy foot soldiers at bay, while cavalry pursued fleeing chariot detachments. The death of Porus's standard-bearer sent shockwaves through his ranks, and when Alexander personally rode into the thick of fight, his presence steeled Macedonian resolve. By day's end, Porus's army lay broken. Yet instead of executing him, Alexander admired his valor and reinstated him as satrap under Macedonian authority, allowing Porus to retain his kingdom in return for tribute and troops. The victory at Hydaspes was Pyrrhic in both manpower and morale. Heavy casualties among skilled soldiers, combined with the loss of elephants and the onset of relentless, rain-soaked campaigning conditions, sapped the army's strength. Moreover, the dense jungle and the labyrinthine network of rivers ahead discouraged further advances. When Alexander attempted to push on toward the land of the serpent-bearers, likely the area of the Ganges headwaters, fierce opposition by yet more regional rulers, especially the Aspagioi and Assakinoi tribes, proved extraordinarily costly. His engineers found it impossible to bridge every river, and low-lying marshes delayed supplies. The men yearned for home. Marching east had become an ordeal rather than a triumph. During this period, Alexander also experimented with the trappings of Eastern monarchy. He adopted Persian-style satrapal regalia, seated himself on high-backed thrones, and accepted gifts of royal robes. He welcomed Indian scholars and ascetics, testing their philosophies against his own Hellenic education. This cultural exchange demonstrated his vision for a syncretic empire, but his troops found such customs alien. By early 325 BC, as the army trudged through broken terrain toward the Hyphasis River, mutiny stoked by exhaustion and longing erupted among senior officers. When senior commanders reminded him that Alexander had promised not to force them beyond the lotus-rich banks of the Hyphasis, Alexander yielded. He declared the limit of his conquests, offering sacrifices to the river deity and agreeing to turn back. This watershed moment revealed both the practicality and humanity of his leadership. While Alexander's ambition knew few bounds, he recognized the necessity of preserving his core force for future campaigns. The march back was a logistical triumph in itself. Crossing back over multiple swollen rivers, Alexander reinvigorated ties with local satraps through lavish hospitality, reorganized garrisons at frontier towns, and re-established lines of supply stretching back to Bactria. His journey home was also an opportunity for administrative reform. He appointed new governors in the eastern satrapies, some drawn from native nobility, and began issuing coinage in the Indian mints, showing Greek legends on one side, Kharosthi script on the other, thus ushering in economic integration. By autumn of 325 BC, the Macedonian army had completed its loop from the Hydaspes to the Hyphasis and back to Bactria. Though they had not ventured to the Ganges' holy waters, Alexander had achieved what no previous Greek ruler had done. He had penetrated the Indian subcontinent's western fringes, forged alliances with local kings, and laid the groundwork for Hellenistic influence in Central and South Asia. The limits of conquest proved not a failure, but a recognition of the balance between ambition and feasibility. In restraining his advance, Alexander preserved the integrity of his army, the coherence of his supply lines, and the foundations of the vast empire he would rule in his final 2 years. The decision at the Hydaspes River to cease further eastward expedition marked a turning point in Alexander's career. His army, hardened by years of campaigning from the Granicus to the Hydaspes, now faced the long trek westward through the heart of his conquests. Yet this return journey was more than a simple reversal. It became a process of reorganization, consolidation, and strategic foresight that would define the final phase of Alexander's reign. As the army retraced its steps through the Punjab, Alexander implemented reforms to stabilize the far-flung territories. He founded additional cities: Alexandria Bucephalus on the Jalem, named for his beloved horse Bucephalus, and Alexandria Nicaea near the Hydaspes, as regional administrative centers. These colonies were stocked with veteran settlers and supported by granaries, ensuring that Greek culture, language, and governance would persist long after his departure. He also dispatched trusted lieutenants such as Accession, Craterus, and Ptolemy to oversee provinces and to raise cavalry regiments recruited from native horsemen. This melding of Macedonian military practice with local manpower strengthened frontier defenses and created a sense of shared stake in the empire's security. During this time, Alexander's retinue included scholars such as Callisthenes the historian and Aristobulus the engineer, who documented both Hellenic traditions and the exotic flora, fauna, and customs they encountered. These intellectuals advised Alexander on potential integration of Indian hyphae systems for irrigation in Mesopotamia, and on the prospects of maritime ventures down the Persian Gulf to Spice Islands. Alexander, ever the visionary, listened with genuine interest, even as his officers grumbled at what they perceived as intellectual distractions from soldierly duties. When the army reached Susa by the spring of 324 BC, Alexander gathered a grand reunion, known as the Susa Weddings, marrying his senior officers to Persian and Median noblewomen to cement bonds between Macedonian and local elites. He himself took Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian chieftain, to wife alongside Statira, daughter of Darius III, symbolizing his union of East and West. 15,000 soldiers followed suit. These mass weddings, while controversial to traditional Macedonian sensibilities, embodied Alexander's policy of fusion. He sought not only to conquer, but to create a new ruling class that transcended Greek and Persian divisions. Yet beneath the pageantry lay strategic calculations. By intermarrying military officers with regional aristocracy, Alexander sought to ensure loyalty and to stake his empire on a multicultural aristocracy invested in centralized cohesion. He introduced Persian-style court ceremonies, in which courtiers prostrated themselves, testing Greek attitudes and refining protocols for his projected rule over a vast populace. As 324 BC progressed, Alexander turned his gaze back toward unresolved frontiers: the Arabian Peninsula, where incense and myrrh caravans beckoned; the Persian Gulf, where naval expeditions under Nearchus promised to open a maritime route to India; and even the possibility of crossing from India into the Indian Ocean, as some captains reported sighting monsoon patterns that could aid sea travel. Alexander began planning a grand circumnavigation of the Arabian Peninsula, envisioning Hellenistic ports from Muscat to Aden and beyond. He authorized Nearchus to survey the coast, to establish anchorages at Hormuz, and to study monsoon winds for future fleets. But these grand plans were cut short by the ever-looming demands of imperial governance. Restiveness in Babylon and Opus reported by satraps indicated that the vast conquests required diligent oversight. The melding of Greek, Persian, and Indian administrative systems had created new bureaucratic complexities. Indeed, Alexander's choice to live in Susa rather than return to Macedon or Athens suggests his prioritization of Eastern governance as the nexus of his empire, a world-spanning polity that owed its cohesion to a blend of military force, dynastic marriage, and syncretic administration. By 323 BC, Alexander had reached the cusp of fulfilling and transcending his original mission. His troops, once a ragtag body of citizen soldiers, had become a transcontinental professional army loyal primarily to him. His satrapies, once Persian provinces, had been refashioned under Macedonian oversight but infused with local customs. His cities, from Alexandria in Egypt to the jungles of the Punjab, stood as beacons of a Hellenistic fusion. Yet the final achievements of Alexander's grand plans remained to be tested against the unwieldy reality of administering such a realm. When illness struck him in Babylon later that year, his vision of continued eastward expansion and integration into Arabia and beyond would perish alongside him. But in the 2 final years of campaigning, reorganization, and planning, Alexander had laid the institutional, cultural, and strategic groundwork for successor kingdoms that would carry forward his legacy, and for a Hellenistic epic that would shape the Mediterranean and Near East for centuries to come. In the summer of 323 BC, Alexander the Great lay stricken in his palace at Babylon. He had conquered the Persian Empire, marched to the edge of India, and forged a realm that spanned 3 continents. Now, at the age of 32, he succumbed to fever, some ancient sources blaming malaria, others suspecting typhoid or poisoning. His final days were spent in delirium, attended by generals who had been his boyhood comrades, yet who now eyed the crownless throne with burgeoning ambition. In his final pronouncements, Alexander entrusted the future to the strongest, a cryptic injunction that unleashed a maelstrom of rivalry among his leading officers, known collectively as the Diadochi, or successors. The first weeks after Alexander's death were a blur of consultations and hastily forged accords. The Macedonian army, which had accompanied him from the Granicus to the Hydaspes, insisted on the immediate appointment of a regent. Perdiccas, his cavalry commander and close confidant, assumed that mantle. Meanwhile, Alexander's half-brother, Aridaeus, was proclaimed king as Philip III, alongside the unborn child of Roxana, Alexander IV. This dual monarchy was a clever compromise on paper, but its practical effect was to concentrate real power in Perdiccas' hands. Yet Perdiccas' elevation would soon meet with resistance from Ptolemy in Egypt, Lysimachus in Thrace, and Antigonus in Anatolia, each determined to carve out autonomous dominions rather than submit to a single regent. By the autumn of 323 BC, the empire's satrapies had become the playing pieces in a deadly game of chess. Perdiccas sought to enforce unity. He marched into Egypt to curb Ptolemy's autonomy, convinced that the Nile provinces were indispensable to the empire's wealth. There, however, his troops, frustrated at fighting their own comrades in a war of inheritance rather than expansion, mutinied on the banks of the Nile. His generals abandoned him, and Perdiccas was assassinated in 321 BC during an ill-fated campaign. His death shattered any hope of restoring Alexander's empire under a single regent and plunged the territories into the first of several Diadochi wars. In the aftermath, a grand settlement at Triparadisus in Syria redistributed satrapies among the upper echelon. Antipater, the veteran regent in Macedon, replaced Perdiccas. Ptolemy retained Egypt, Seleucus secured Babylon, and Antigonus Monophthalmus received Phrygia and Lycia. Yet this fragile balance barely survived the departure of Antipater to Macedonia and his subsequent death in 319 BC. His son, Cassander, seized power in Greece, while Eumenes of Cardia rallied eastern satraps in support of the Argead line, flaring another round of conflict. By 315 BC, the struggle had coalesced into broad coalitions. Antigonus, seeking to reunite Alexander's conquests under his own aegis, battled Ptolemy in Syria and faced Seleucus in Babylonia. Eumenes, fighting on behalf of the royal house, confronted Antigonus in Asia Minor's mountains, his skillful use of mercenaries and elephants prolonging the war. The Second Diadochi War from 311 to 309 BC ended inconclusively with Eumenes' betrayal and execution, leaving Antigonus as the most powerful of Alexander's successors. Yet Antigonus's ambitions drew a confederation of foes. In 302 BC, Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus formed a league that confronted Antigonus at the decisive Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC. Antigonus fell in the field, and his holdings were partitioned. Lysimachus took Anatolia, Seleucus gained Syria and parts of Asia Minor, while Ptolemy solidified his grip on the eastern Mediterranean islands and Phoenicia. The Argead heirs, namely Alexander IV and Philip III, had been eliminated or sidelined, and with them died the last vestiges of dynastic unity. By the end of 301 BC, Alexander's empire lay irrevocably divided among 4 dynastic lines: the Antigonids in Macedon and Greece, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids across Mesopotamia, Persia, and much of Asia Minor, and the Lysimachids in Thrace and parts of western Anatolia. These Hellenistic kingdoms retained Greek language, coinage, and royal customs, but evolved independently, often clashing over borderlands and spheres of influence. Trade and culture continued to flow along the routes Alexander had pioneered: the royal road, the ports of the Levant, and the monasteries of the East, yet political unity was a memory. The wars of the Diadochi thus illustrate both the brilliance and the fragility of Alexander's achievement. Without his unifying personality, the vast empire he forged splintered under the weight of competing ambitions, geographic distances, and the centrifugal forces of local identities. Nonetheless, the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged preserved facets of his legacy, ensuring that Alexander's dream of a cosmopolitan world endured long beyond its fleeting political unity. Thank you for joining Ancient Odyssey on this final chapter of Alexander's life and the tumultuous wars of the Diadochi. We have seen how the boundless ambitions of a single conqueror gave way to the rivalries of his lieutenants, reshaping the Near Eastern geopolitical landscape for centuries. If you've enjoyed exploring how empire building and fratricidal conflict intertwined in the wake of Alexander's death, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more journeys through antiquity's grand sagas. Until our next expedition, stay curious, stay bold, and keep uncovering history's hidden empires.